It's been a whole 4 minutes since I talked about Deltarune, so let's talk about Deltarune. Chapter 5 is probably fast approaching, so I figured I would go ahead and go through all the theories that have been popping up in the last few months since Chapter 3 and 4 dropped. So if you want an overview of what the community has been cooking up with some very biased opinions from me, then here you go. There will be full spoilers for Undertale and Deltarune. So let's start off with the basics. Theories that are very common and pretty simple to understand. That's not a slight against them though, as these theories have some of the highest likelihood of being correct in my opinion. So first off, Chapter 5 world is in the Flower King. So Chapter 5 is likely set in the Flower King, at least partially. I mean, there are the locked double doors, the mysterious basement, the 7 souls, flowers, and lots of hints there will be lots of flowers in the next chapter. It's not as set in stone as Chapter 3 was, but it seems to be the clear candidate. More on Chapter 5's Dark World later. Friend will be the main villain of Deltarune. This is less of a clear-cut theory and more of the simple speculation that Friend, which is this cat in this face that laughs, will be very important to Deltarune's story, with it specifically being the Tale of Hell and the tale which was not be followed mentioned in Chapter 4. It's also likely that the Friend is also the egg which Noelle found when she was younger, which is mentioned in her website from Spamton Sweepstakes, which helps explain why this tale is made out of dots, like in her game. And the way that Friend is named in the files is also associated with the voice of the start of Deltarune, who is probably Gaster. Later theories will talk more about the Friend, but the theory that's become somewhat standard for the Deltarune community at this point is the Friend was not only the being who somehow made Des disappear, perhaps who followed it out into the woods or into the bunker or something, but Friend is also the being that is behind most of the bad things happening in the game, like Spamton and Jevil going insane, and that the game will eventually focus on Friend as the main antagonist. As for my opinion, yeah, this theory pretty much checks out. I think Friend will have an important role pretty soon in the game, but I don't know if it'll actually be the main antagonist per se. The voice and trophies are Gaster. This is one of the most established theories in Deltarune, coming from before even the first chapter released, as Toby Fox's Twitter account was originally ran by the voice, who many people speculated was Gaster at the time. But anyways, there's a ton of evidence that the voice at the start of the game is W.D. Gaster, the mystery man from Undertale. For example, they talk similarly. There are several variables in the introduction set to 666, a number often associated with Gaster in Undertale. The music for the intro, Another Hymn, has Gaster's leitmotif in it. The vessel created by the player is referred to as a goner in the files, which is the same name associated with Gaster's grayscale followers in Undertale. And the theory continues on to say that Deltarune was, in some way, created by Gaster. Perhaps he is how we, the player, were able to connect with the world of the game, and the program of Deltarune, my Deltarune as he calls it, was created by Gaster. For what purpose, we don't know. Perhaps he is trying to fulfill or break the prophecy in Deltarune, or maybe he has more sinister motivations. Either way, this is kind of the key mystery in both Undertale and Deltarune, the background story which Toby Fox has been building up for over a decade at this point. And while it is true that the fandom around Deltarune has the tendency of connecting Gaster to literally everything, and it can get a bit annoying, but yeah, there is a reason he keeps popping up. The Forgotten Man is Gaster's enemy. The Forgotten Man, or the Eggman, is the dude who hangs out behind trees in hidden areas and gives eggs to Kris. This happens in each chapter, and we know very little about the man or his eggs. He kinda speaks like Gaster, in all caps, but in a little more old-timey and less clinical way. But there's also an important note. In the PlayStation version of Deltarune, there are trophies for doing stuff in the game, including the ones you get for completing each chapter. These trophies are all written in a similar style to the voice's style of writing, and if we infer that they were made by Gaster, we can learn a little bit about him. First off, even in the weird route, Gaster marks the chapter is complete without issue whenever we finish it. So for whatever reason, he doesn't mind which route you're following. In fact, there's only one thing that will make Gaster not mark a chapter as complete without an issue, and that's if you get the eggs. So something about getting these eggs messes with Gaster's plan or experiment, and we can be led to believe that the Forgotten Man is working against Gaster in some way. Another interesting part of this theory is about the tree that the Forgotten Man is hiding behind. In the Chapter 4 egg room, Kris tries to sketch what they saw behind the tree, and they draw over and over again until it becomes a big gray blur and then they cover it up with a tree. Perhaps the eggs and the man are a way for Kris to recover the repressed memory that they have of what's behind the tree. And for whatever reason, Gaster really doesn't want Kris to remember. Severed hand theory. Kris is gonna lose a hand. That's the theory. But there is a surprising amount of hints that make this kind of believable. Whenever you look through the Chapter 1 Shadow Crystal in the Light World, you look right through your hand. There's also a line that says you couldn't find your hand in the hidden ball machine room. In the Snowgrave route, Kris bites their hand to avoid telling Susie that they'll never play the piano again if the player chooses that option. Susie and Noelle also talk about a horror movie where the protagonist loses a hand which comes to life. So I have no idea if this is something that will happen or if it's just symbolism. Maybe symbolism for how Kris doesn't have control because of the player and because of their deal with Carol. I'm personally leaning more towards symbolism than them literally losing a hand. But hey, there's a lot of hand-related stuff in Undertale and Deltarune, even ignoring Kris. So who knows, maybe the player will take over their hand or something and they'll cut it off. Des is the knight. Around 99% of people believe that in some way, Des is the knight. And well, for good reason, there's a lot of evidence to support this. Des is obviously missing. The knight's design has both antlers and a baseball bat, and we can find a wiffle ball bat in Des's room in chapter 4. Story-wise, it also really seems like Des being the knight is what is being built up to, with Carol being the red herring. Her motivations as the knight are a bit hard to parse though. Perhaps she's opening all these fountains so she can bring herself back. Or maybe it's to make the prophecy come true and banish the angels' heaven. Or maybe she's evil and just wants to cause the roaring for fun. The one issue is that it really seems like Des is also the voice in the source code. If you didn't know, with each chapter, there is some dialogue hidden in the source code of Deltarune that seems to be a character who's trapped in some sort of purgatory. For obvious reasons, most people theorize that this is Des. But like, how is she both a knight and in the code? A common theory is that her soul is stuck in the source code or her body is the knight, either running around soulless like Flowey or being piloted by someone else. Personally, while I do agree that she is the most likely candidate for the knight, I do think there are some noticeable holes in this theory, especially whenever it comes to motivation. It's definitely stuff that could be explained soon, but it's also kind of interesting that the knight seems to be teamed up with Kris and Carol, especially as Kris is never mentioned to have a history of friendship with Des. So something must have happened that we don't know about if the two have teamed up. Sans and Papyrus travel to Undertale. And finally, one of the most ubiquitous theories in the community is that Sans and possibly Papyrus are the same Sans and Papyrus that you run into in Undertale. Deltarune is theorized to be a sort of prequel to the game, and the idea is that they escape to Undertale, whether it be in an alternate universe or some weird sort of dark world or whatever. And this explains why they only recently moved into Snowden in Undertale, and why Sans has experience with the player messing with the world in Undertale. There's not a lot of evidence for this, especially as Sans has had very little to do in chapters 3 and 4, and Papyrus is still missing, but it would be cool. Okay, so I got the kind of generic theories out of the way. Time for the heavy hitters. These are the theories that have long documents or videos about them, and they usually have at least a few crazy claims and a cool name. This video is focusing on theories that haven't been disproven by chapters 3 and 4. And it's also avoiding theories that are just like noticing patterns, like chess theory and stuff. Especially since that one's now been disproven, as I think patterns and stuff like that are pretty boring. Also, all the videos I'm talking about here are linked, so if you think a theory sounds interesting, then go check it out, as there's usually quite a few details and quite a bit of evidence that I'll be leaving out in these summaries. But let's get into it. Roots theory by GoldPro is one of the most popular new theories in Deltarune, and for good reason. The theory is concerning Friend and interprets events in the arcade game we play in chapter 3 in a way that makes a lot of sense. The theory begins by pointing out that roots is an important word that has been hinted at throughout Deltarune in many places, especially in soundtracks like Digital Roots and Bit Roots, as well as this mysterious piece of the prophecy near the chapter 4 egg room. Basically, it's all building up towards the actual roots location that will probably take place in chapter 5. So in chapter 2, we've had Digital Roots in Queen's Basement, which is a dark area filled with vines, brown walls, and the very first appearance of the Friend face. And secondly, we have Bit Roots in chapter 3, the 8-bit area where we get the Shadow Mantle. These two areas have very different layouts, but could be abstract representations of the same area, in a similar way to how the arcade game represents chapter 2. We know the 8-bit game is a representation of the events of the Weird Route, with it recreating the events of chapter 2 with Noelle freezing a bunch of enemies, including a blue bird. So then the area after chapter 2 in the arcade game, which the theory just calls Bit Roots, seems to be the next step in the Weird Route, chapter 5's Weird Route. And the layout of Bit Roots closely mirrors Hometown's map, and the enemies seem to symbolically represent Hometown NPCs. So chapter 5's Dark World could be the whole of Hometown during the parade, with Kris seemingly attacking and killing every member of Hometown in the Dark World in the Weird Route. As for why the Dark World is all of Hometown and not just the Flower King shop, whenever most hints up to now have mostly mentioned flowers and a great forest, notice how flowers are being hung out throughout the town in preparation for the festival. This could transform the Dark World into a vast garden like Gerson describes in his book series. Plus, we know from the scene in Carol's house that Asriel wants to use his Dark Shard to prove something to everyone. So it makes sense that he would take up the entire town and everyone in it into his Dark World, instead of just making one inside of the Flower King. Also, for some evidence from outside the game itself, Toby Fox has mentioned that the layout of Hometown was something that was very important for him to get right from the beginning, which makes sense as it is revisited in every single chapter, but it could also imply that it had to be right for it to work well in the chapter 5 Dark World. And also the theory claims the Digital Roost, the area from chapter 2 in Queen's Basement, is actually a sub-area of the chapter 4 Dark World. It's the basement of the Flower King, an area we can only enter in the Weird Route. and it's where the friend boss fight will be. In fact, the whole reason that we were powering up Noelle in Chapter 2 and Kris in Chapter 4, as well as getting things like the Shadow Mantle and the Black Shard, are so the two of them can face Friend and have a chance of defeating them. So yeah, this is a fairly complicated theory that makes a few leaps, mostly whenever it comes to what role Friend will actually play in the game. But I think it mostly checks out. If it is true, then Chapter 5 will be the real turning point of the story, because it will be impossible to go back fully to the status quo, now that the whole town has been inside a dark world. Especially in the weird route, and I think it's likely this said weird route might just end right here in Chapter 5, if we are actually killing, or at least comatosing everyone in Hometown. So huge credit to GoldPro not only for the theory, but also for the video itself, as it's one of the best looking and highest effort Deltarune videos I've seen. Next up is Red Cross theory, bipolarity. And surprise, this actually builds on Root's theory, kind of. So the setup for this theory is just that Death's Knight has some big holes in it, with the main being, why is she doing all this nice stuff, what's the motive? And also what's going on in the source code? If that is Death's, then how is she also the Knight? Well, the theory basically posits that, since we all know that Kris's soul is likely not in their body, perhaps it is in Death's body, and that is the Knight. This explains how Kris communicates with the Knight as they are talking to themselves. And it also explains why the Knight has similar animation in battle to Kris, and also why Kris gets so dizzy during the Chapter 3 Knight fight, as they are literally fighting themselves. Part of the theory that connects to the Roots theory is that in the Chapter 3 bit Roots area, we can actually change an unused variable in the code named Toriel for some reason, and changing this variable makes a sprite for a white cloaked entity in the Chapter 2 section of the 8-bit game, assumed to be Noelle, actually changed to look like a deer. But this variable also changes the enemy in the bit Roots section to look like a black deer, like Des. This is important for two reasons. One, this black deer enemy mirrors a player's movement in the room, further strengthening the theory that Kris reflects the Knight's movements. And two, this location in Bitroots lines up with a big body of water in the real world. The body of water, which mentioned that music can be heard coming up from below the water. Perhaps this is where Des' soul is located. So basically, the Knight is controlled by Kris's original soul, while they exist as a soulless entity, like Flowey, unless they're being controlled by the player's soul, or the soul given to the player. It might not literally be ours. The Knight is Des' body, controlled by Kris's soul, while Des is stuck in the source code purgatory. This explains the Knight's motives, as Kris is working with Carol in order to save Des, and they're putting the lives of everyone at risk in order to do that. Rather than Des selfishly putting the town at risk for ourselves, others are putting the town at risk in order to save Des. And also the voice that Des hears in the source code purgatory is Kris's, and Kris is keeping her soul alive in there somehow, while they use their soul to pilot Des' body, and Kris allows their body to be controlled by the player so they can close dark fountains and do other prophecy stuff. Personally, one of the most striking pieces of evidence for me is how the dark worlds created by the Knight look very similar to the one we know is created by Kris, especially when compared to how different Susie's dark world in Chapter 4 looks. But I recommend watching the original video for this theory especially, as there's quite a bit more evidence provided that might convince you. I can see this theory as being true, but it's also kinda convoluted, with how many people's souls and bodies are being controlled by other people. So that makes me a little more iffy on it, but a lot of things do line up with the game. So we'll see. Asriel Knight. This theory comes from the Mason Gamer, who is an avid proponent of it online, and while there are others who talk about it, his write-ups are by far the most solid in my opinion. So let's get started. First off, baseball. The Knight's sword, initially looking like a bat, has been used to connect it to Des, as she has a wiffle bat in her room. But remember, lots of Asriel's stuff is in Des' room. And in Undertale, there actually is an unused item concept revealed in a 10th anniversary stream, Asriel's shirt and bat. Furthermore, the bat in Undertale did 40 damage, and the Knight has a base damage of 40. The Knight's attacks also look similar to Asriel's God of Hyperdeath boss fight, with shooting stars, a final attack similar to Hypergoner, and a similar laugh. Both the Knight and Asriel also use a sword, and they use both hands for attacks, while holding the sword in their left hand whenever they're not using it. And they also both shoot beams of light out of their hands. Beyond the attacks, Asriel and Flowey share many musical motifs with the Knight. For example, in Black Knife, the Knight's battle theme, the Burden and Despair theme from Asriel's fight is played. A siren-like sound is also played in Black Knife, similar to the one that plays in your best nightmare. The Knight is also known to Aura Farm. It's very smug and cocky, very similar to how Asriel behaved throughout Undertale. And the Roaring Knight also has a similar edgy OC vibe, similar to the god of Hyperdeath in Undertale. The Knight also has poses similar to Kris, and this could be explained by Asriel Knight, as the two would have literally been siblings. And it makes sense that they would pick up similar poses and mannerisms after a lifetime of living together. Plus, Asriel's favorite character in the Smash Bros. Knockoff is a sword wizard, which isn't a bad way of describing the Knight. Asriel being the Knight also helps explain why the Knight wastes so much time in Chapter 3 before capturing Toriel. As that was never Asriel's plan, and he doesn't want to hurt Toriel in any way. He just wanted to bait Undyne into the Dark World. This theory also explains why Kris keeps hiding things about Asriel from the player, like his search history room. In fact, if you refuse to open the door to Asriel's search history room, it reads, "You have a feeling that you wouldn't learn anything," which is the exact same phrase that is used whenever trying to inspect the Knight in the fight. Kris analyzed the enemy, but Kris couldn't learn anything. And finally, this helps explain why Kris is working with the Knight, as Kris didn't really have a history of deaths. While it's possible they could have gotten roped into a plan with her, it makes even more sense for Asriel to start the plan to rescue his lost girlfriend and recruit Carol and Kris to help him. There are some obvious problems though. First, Asriel is supposed to be at college. However, he really only needs to have left like a week early in order to start appearing as the Knight by the start of the game. So it's possible that his absence hasn't been reported yet, especially as the internet is stated to have been out in hometown for a few days. As for the antlers, well personally I think that's the biggest problem with the theory. But they could just be a part of the helmet. The Knight can shapeshift into a ball and seemingly turn a bat into a sword. So it makes sense that they can make a cool helmet in honor of deaths. And there's even more evidence, such as the Knight seemingly crying, which could parallel Asriel's crying that's described in Chapter 4, is the crying and crying and crying boy. There's also an unused Knight sound that's a manipulated version of Asriel's laughter from Undertale. And there's even more stuff like this. Plus, every Dark World but the one Susie creates is pretty similar and references stuff from Kris's and Asriel's childhood. And Asriel being the Knight is a pretty good explanation of this, as he and Kris share a lot of the same memories. Also, if Asriel created the Church Dark World, that explains why Gerson was able to come back, as Asriel was deeply religious, and he likely knew Gerson well. So he created a Dark World, and the old man Gerson we meet is patterned after his memory of the man. If Asriel is the Knight, it can also tie into the themes of Deltarune, specifically the themes of escapism and lingering on the past. Asriel is clinging to the past with death, similarly to how poorly he took the loss of Kara in Undertale, and now he's doing horrible things to try to bring death back. But here's the absolutely insane part of this, the part that honestly might go too far, but it's also too interesting to leave out. And I'm just gonna straight up play the section from the Spooky Dude's theory review over this theory here, as I don't know a better way to summarize it.
In the late 1770s, a man named Asriel Gaster was born. His great-grandson, Theodore Herzl Gaster, was a renowned biblical scholar specializing in comparative religion, mythology, and the history of religion. His most important book is titled Thespis, Ritual, Myth, and Drama in the Ancient Near East from the year 1950. The book is incredibly relevant to Undertale and Deltarune, and it seems to be one of Toby Fox's biggest inspirations. It's a long book, but some highlights include: fettered monsters escape at the end of the world. Giant or monster is fettered in depths of the earth. His movements cause earthquakes. When he succeeds in freeing himself from the fetters and escapes, the world will end. This seems very much like the Titans. There's a line about drinking in another world and drinking from a certain river between two darknesses. There's a line about objects attacked under the illusion that they are men. And finally, there is a line in this book that states, "Faithful brother transforms self to deer to seek sister." Asriel is the faithful brother, who transforms himself to a deer to seek December.
Yeah, Asriel Gaster was a real guy. Something not actually mentioned in the summary of the theory is actually what comparative mythology means. It's a study that takes different myths throughout history. It looks at how shared stories evolve throughout history. And this is kind of similar to what's going on with the Prophecy, Dragon Blazers, and Lord of the Hammers, is they're all retellings of similar stories. So Deltarune's themes are all connected to this book. In summary, Asriel is the Knight searching for deaths. That's the theory. Okay, so for some reason people hate this theory. And honestly, I don't really get why. There's some pretty solid evidence for it, but people get really defensive over Death Knight for whatever reason. One of the big complaints is that Asriel being the twist villain is too similar to Undertale, but there are tons of ways that Asriel being the Knight could result in a very different story than Undertale, especially as they were actually evil as Flowey, but if he's the Knight, well, he might be doing some bad things. He's got a more positive motivation, but he could absolutely be redeemed by the end. I also personally don't think that the Knight will be the true in-game boss in the game. After all, Kris is working with them. I expect the Knight storyline to be resolved in Chapter 5 or 6, and in Chapter 7's deal with whatever caused Des to disappear in the first place, whether that be Friend, Gaster, the Angel, or whatever. And overall, I'm personally not super attached to any theory I cover in this video, as I think it's all just fun. But I do think that Asriel is a solid Knight candidate, even if I do overall still favor Des. Ralsei is not an object. This theory is by Kimmy Boy G, and while its claim isn't as far-reaching or impactful as some other theories, it's got some of the most rock-solid reasoning out of any theory I've seen come out of the community. The theory, or factual statement as it calls itself, goes through all the objects that Ralsei could be and shows the problems with each. For example, if he's something like the headband or green crayon for Kris's house, then why does he not have a history with the other characters at the Dreamer residence? You would think Tina or Ram would recognize him. Furthermore, if Ralsei is an object that Kris has always had on them, something that's in their pocket, why doesn't he appear the same way that characters like Rose or Lancer do? Characters in Kris's pocket always hop out of it whenever they come into the Dark World, but Ralsei is always at a different location in the Dark World than Susie and Kris start at. Furthermore, it's unlikely that Ralsei is an object that Kris or someone else hides in each room before the Dark World is formed. As in Chapter 4, not only do we search the entire church and not find the object, but Ralsei also appears in both of the church Dark Worlds. So if he is an object, how would he move from one Dark World to the other one? Other old theories, like Ralsei being Asriel's dust, don't really check out now that we've seen Gerson and the Old Man Darkner created by his dust, as the two are basically the same character, while Ralsei is an Asriel in appearance, name, and possibly personality. Plus, the game makes it clear that the Old Man appearing in the church Dark World was an unusual occurrence that only happens in very specific circumstances. Also, Ralsei appears in every Dark World, and he doesn't turn to stone, and he also claims to have existed in the castle town with the main Dark Fountain for his whole existence before the game. So not only would Ralsei have no reason to lie about this, but he also just really behaves like someone who has had zero socialization before now. So it really doesn't seem like he's been lying too much about his past. He probably has always been in the Closet Dark World. I do think it's worth questioning though, why the Closet Dark World is so important in the first place. So what is Ralsei then? Well, in Chapter 4, we see a Titan being born out of pure darkness, and it and Ralsei have a bit in common, as they are the only two Darkners who have a physical effect on the Light World, with the Titan messing up the church, and Ralsei opening and closing the gates between Dark Worlds which represent doors in the real world. So perhaps only pure, so to say, Darkners are beings who are born and formed only in the Dark World, and not born out of an object in the Light World or able to affect the Light World. Perhaps Ralsei is like a Titan or the opposite of a Titan or something. But the theory also has a bigger claim, and it's that Ralsei is a goner. Gaster created Ralsei, similar to the goner we see at the start of Deltarune, and this is how Ralsei knows the rules of the world and the prophecy, as Gaster taught him those. This also explains some of Ralsei's meta knowledge, as Ralsei not only knows some of the names of songs in the game, but he also hums one of them. And this could be because Gaster is the being which in some way created the program of Deltarune. So he probably also has access to the music and must have shown it to Ralsei. And with us learning that goners can be colored in, it also makes it all the more likely that Ralsei could be a goner. So for my personal take on this theory, I do 100% agree that Ralsei is not a physical object. I don't know if he's a goner. I think he might be a Darkner formed of something more metaphysical, like hope or belief in the prophecy or something. But there is absolutely evidence for the goner theory as well. Okay, so what about the biggest of big names? What about the game theorist? Well, it's not Matt Pat anymore. It's a guy named Tom Robinson, who apparently worked for Fox and Disney before this, which is a pretty funny background for a Deltarune theorist, but let's see what he has to say. So it starts off by recapping everything, and then it establishes that Des is likely the Knight, but this theory is focused on the prophecy and Susie's part in it. And they also make sure to call a lot of attention to the fact that your choices don't matter is an important mantra in Deltarune, and so the prophecy must be fixed and unavoidable, even in the weird route. But the theory continues on to say that the second hero in the prophecy is actually not Susie, it's Noelle. Plus, love finds its way to the girl is actually describing the weird route, where the player makes Noelle freeze Darkners in Chapter 2, and she becomes more powerful. And the love means level of violence enacted like in Undertale. There is also a twisted sword, which you can make out of the Thorn Ring and the currently unobtainable Pure Crystal in the weird route, so maybe Noelle will use that sword. A pretty interesting piece of evidence that they give for Susie not being a hero in the prophecy, but instead a separate girl, and the one who is mentioned in the "at last was the girl" prophecy section, is that there are actually 4 triangles in this specific Deltarune symbol in the arcade game in Chapter 3, which is interesting, but then why are all the other Deltarunes always 3 triangles, including ones shown in the very prophecy they're talking about? If the prophecy is always correct and unchanging, then why the discrepancy? Finally, the theory ends with the belief that the final bit of the prophecy that Susie and Ralsei read was that Susie will end up dying in order to save everybody and in order to banish the angel's headman, where the player is the angel. I kind of half-heartedly agree that this is the most obvious thing it could be. Susie is the sort of person who would accept their death if it saved others, and who would also hide the truth from Kris, although I do find it strange that Ralsei was trying to hide Susie's prophesized death from her, as it's a much bigger omission than the other ones he's made so far, and definitely paints his character in a more negative light in my opinion. But overall, this theory basically focuses on the idea that there is no free will or hope for the characters in Deltarune. In actuality, the weird route is the true route, the route destined by the prophecy. And it will end with the player taking control of Noelle and then Susie saving Noelle by sacrificing herself, allowing Noelle to banish us with the power we gave her. So personally, I like how the video lays out the way the weird route will go, and I don't hate the idea that the prophecy is about the weird route. But the problem is, where does this leave the normal route? Especially since this video is so focused, at least near the beginning, on how our choices don't matter and how the prophecy must be correct. I don't know how we could keep that idea while also describing how there are two different routes and the prophecy only describes one of them. I personally believe that the your choices don't matter is an important theme of Deltarune, but rather than being an actually true statement that the game is trying to back up, Deltarune is instead examining the nature of things like prophecies and predestination in a narrative, with characters like Ralsei and Kris being stripped of their free will and the story ultimately rejecting the initial premise of choices not mattering with a true ending. But we'll see. So let's look at another way the prophecy could go. This time, it's a spooky dude theory. And it starts with a disclaimer that the final prophecy is likely impossible to fully know right now, as it is an intentionally missing puzzle piece. But we can look through hints in the story to get an idea, especially if we take a look at Ralsei and Susie's actions, as they're the only two who know the full prophecy. So first off, the final prophecy probably isn't about destroying the Dark Worlds or disconnecting them from the Light World, because it has to be something that Susie believes Ralsei would absolutely not be willing to happen. And he would definitely be willing to sacrifice all Darkners or disconnect them from the Light World if the prophecy told him to. It's also likely that the prophecy has to do with a character making a choice that results in something morally awful. This is because, throughout the game so far, Ralsei seems to believe that the choice can be avoided through simple kindness. By treating everyone in the Dark World kindly, and especially by trying to get Susie to treat everyone kindly, he reasons that it could be possible to work things out without this final sacrifice, as being kind could change a person's mind and make them not do the horrible action. It's also worth looking at how Susie reacted to the prophecy. First off, it's possible that she is actually misreading the prophecy. It's similar to the previous theory, she could actually not be the second hero, the girl of hope crossing our hearts. And if Noelle is actually that hero, then maybe Susie's confidence that the prophecy can be avoided is misplaced. Of course, Susie could also just be posturing for Kris and Ralsei, as it is clear the prophecy scared her. So maybe she is currently in denial about it coming true. And finally, the most interesting part of the theory, in my opinion, is the character whose horrible choice could cause this consequence is most likely Kris. This is because Kris is secretly working with the Roaring Knight. They're allowing the fountains to be created and hiding information from Susie. So Spooky Dude also believes that, since this tragedy is being set up, the normal route of Deltarune will include this tragedy not being avoided. Because just as a basic narrative tool, whenever a story sets up something that could go wrong, it'll probably go wrong. Personally, I agree with this. I think it could be done in a way similar to the pacifist and true pacifist routes in Undertale, as you'll have to do something extra in order to avoid or counteract the consequences of the prophecy. Perhaps it'll be some timeline trickery, the results in sands of papyrus being sent to Undertale. Okay, and now that I'm clear with the big theories, it's time to finish with a lightning round. These are smaller theories, and some of them are kind of stupid, but some of them are also pretty interesting. So first off, Hybrid Susie. Susie is the only monster we've seen bleed in Deltarune, and from dialogue in the Light World, we know that not only do monsters turn into dust whenever they die, they also don't seem to know how to deal with blood in their day-to-day life, just like Undertale. Susie also knows how to clean up blood, consumes blood, and has been ostracized her whole life. So perhaps this is because she is part human, part monster, which is unusual in this world. We know that Sans also bleeds in Undertale, but then he walks away and turns into dust. So perhaps this isn't true and monsters can bleed, but turn to dust when they die. But I do think the talk of blood is interesting and maybe hinting towards a future reveal of Susie. But I also feel there's a decent chance that this is true, but we never find out for sure, as there are quite a few small details from Undertale that we still don't really know. And this theory comes from the Deltarune subreddit. Quote, "My theory is that the Inferno of Jealousy refers to most of the cast being jealous of the others in some way, not just Asgore being jealous of Sans. Kris, Noelle, and Susie will be a love triangle disaster with each other, thinking that they're third wheeling on the other two's dates. Early will be jealous he doesn't have what the others do, and being so alone and isolated, Ralsei will be jealous of being useless and not being real." I could definitely see this theory being true for Chapter 5, as there have been a lot of setup for characters to be jealous of each other, although I don't really know about a love triangle. Maybe that could happen in the weird route, where Kris is taking Noelle to the parade, but I don't really see it happening in the main route. I do think things could also really boil over for the finale of this chapter. especially considering characters like Spamton, who are so defined by their jealousy of others. So once again, this kind of reinforces that I think that Chapter 5 will be a real turning point for the series. So there are 3 chapters left, and if they're anything like the last 4, that means we're going to get at least 3 more Dark Worlds. So other than Chapter 5, where could they be? First off, Noelle's Mansion Dark World. The fact that Carol stores everything here seems like it can make a very important Dark World. Maybe not the only one in a chapter, but going through the place and learning more about the holiday's past and uncovering the truth behind Carol's plans could make for a great chapter. And second is the Hospital Dark World, which I mean, maybe it could work. It could bring Rudy into the world and do something more with his characters, maybe even temporarily heal him Spy Kids 3 style. But I don't really know what you'd fit into a Hospital Dark World. I don't think it would really make for that interesting of a world design, but I could be proven wrong. And of course, the Bunker Dark World. I think this is the clearest case for a Dark World. I also think it would be cool if we had to switch between a Bunker Dark World and the Light World in order to navigate through locked off doors and stuff. Kinda like that time travel level in Titanfall 2. And this theory comes from this YouTube short.
And I saw a Deltarune theory that is also an Undertale theory. Do you remember at the start of Undertale how the monsters were banished to the underground and you saw the shape of this human? Well, this looks a lot like Kris. Obviously aged up, but the stance with how they hold the weapon just makes it impossible for me to see anything except this. The idea of Kris locking their family underground in a separate timeline makes this so much darker, and I definitely wouldn't be opposed to seeing some Deltarune fan content expand upon this idea.
So is Deltarune a prequel? Or was Kris in Undertale's universe the human who actually sealed the monsters? I think there is something to be said about how similar Kris and the human in the Undertale intro look, but I also kinda doubt this will be important. So this theory states that Friend is the primordial form of Darkners before they take on the appearance of a real-world object. This is why they appear in several places and are also sometimes cats, as is a reference to Schrodinger's cat, as the Friend Darkners are currently in superposition, and so could become any form once observed or connected to an object. This is also why they specifically are shown in the Chapter 3 cutscene explaining Darkners. Plus, we also know that according to Ralsei, the purpose of Darkners is to be there for Lightners. So their purpose is a friend? This is a pretty neat theory, but also what about all the talk of Tales of Hell and such? Perhaps the owner of the tale is a separate cat or, well, I guess dog character, but it really seems like Friend is a specific character, rather than a bunch of them. Still, like everything around Friend, there's still so much speculation that it's hard to say. I do like this theory though. And this is the absolute worst theory in the entire video, but it's from Possible Rain on Reddit. And it's a Ralsei Vore theory. Ralsei in the Light World is a piece of chalk that Susie ate in Chapter 1, and that's how he's able to travel to other Dark Worlds with us. Hopefully not. And this is the Kris Slash theory. And the theory is basically that Kris was the one who slashed Ralsei and Susie in the night fight. In other words, they slashed them. So there's quite a few points for and against this. And you can see them all in this image here. But my main problem with the theory is, why would Ralsei and Susie accept Kris attacking them? This is literally never brought up, and plus why would Kris blow their cover whenever they could just have the Knight attack them? I just don't get the point of why Kris would do it. It seems like an unnecessary risk. Kris Goon's theory. This also comes from Reddit, of course, and has already resulted in this unfortunate thumbnail coming into creation. So it basically states that Kris is the one who wanted the How to Draw Dragons book. And the reason they never returned it is because they're still using it. All humans are genderless. Based on our sample size of 1, 3 if you count the Undertale children, this could be right. I kinda doubt we'll see any more humans in Deltarune, so we might as well chalk this up as true. Deltarune is Omori. There's a somewhat silent protagonist with a knight, a missing older sister, older brother who used to date missing sister is in college for the first part of the game, themes of escapism and entering worlds that are sort of a mirror of the real world, the main character is repressing something, and more that are spoilers for Omori. This isn't that serious of a theory, but it is interesting just how many parts are similar between the two games, especially since Toby Fox and Omocat have worked together before and seem to have been in contact for a very long time. Woody theory. Still. The Woody theory, or Friend Inside Me, is a theory from before Chapters 3 and 4 came out, and I basically guessed that Chapter 3 would be more cowboy themed than a general TV themed, based on an old joke song Toby Fox made and some other stuff. Of course, this didn't happen. It's what they want you to think. With Toy Story 5 coming out the same year as Deltarune Chapter 5, it's now becoming pretty clear that they are actually one and the same. Yes, Deltarune Chapter 5 and Toy Story 5 will be merged into one huge game/movie that'll be the future of entertainment. And that's everything. Obviously, that wasn't literally every theory made for Deltarune, but it's a lot of the ones that I thought were interesting and popular enough that I felt needed to be included. Overall, I think theorizing is pretty fun, as there are a lot of ways that Deltarune can go. And while my main focus will always be with the actual content of the game and analyzing the story and gameplay that we already have, it's also fun to go through the insane things that the fandom is cooking up while we wait for Chapter 5. This channel got its first bit of success off of Deltarune. I figured I should come back at least this one time. But anyways, be sure to subscribe for my eventual Chapter 5 video whenever that finally comes out, and videos over other indie games, movies, and whatever else I can cover. You can check out my response to a terrible Deltarune review here, or maybe watch my analysis I made of Deltarune back whenever Chapters 3 and 4 came out. But that's all. Thanks for watching. Bye.